An original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, here we go. Look at that. It's another Tuesday on Now and Next. I'm Dave Trafford. Welcome in. Right here from Story Studio Network. And lots going on in the studio and in the Story Studio Network these days. So, just thought it was time to sort of sit back and take stock of where we are. And what I find interesting, this really weird thing happened to me on Saturday morning. I had nothing to do. House was quiet, and poured a second cup, and I started to reflect on and listen to some of the shows that we have been working on lately. And if you're like me, you know, you can get really close to your work, right? And it's too easy to lose sight of not just what you've accomplished, but what your team has accomplished. And I say this all the time, and I know Erin is really good at it. She's the strategic brain behind this. She's pulling the team. There's no question about it. They rely on me more or less for my old-time network, people I know, but mostly for doing what I do, which is to be the creative executive producer here. And so between the two of us, we've got our lanes carved out. But we've got producers like Becky Coles and Jen Hudson working with us. We've got hosts like Barb DiGiulio and Kim Geddes. And Sarah Thorne over at Engineering with Nature. We've got Jeff Musson, who dips his toe in every once in a while as a co-host on one of our shows. But he spends most of his time working on coding for veterans. And then we've got the folks who do all the magic in terms of making sure that all of this makes sense from a marketing and business perspective. We got Troy and Andrea on that team, and that's just they're new to this, everything that we're doing here, which is really kind of cool. And then to round out the production team, we've got the likes of Drew Garner and Mike Trutler. You hear them in the credits. Old friend Nick Myrano. And Paul Gatt doing work with us as well. So we've gone from, 2.5 people, and that half person is now pretty much got her hands on everything, is now leading the team and making sure that the strategy side stays aligned with the creative side and the production side, and that's Jamie Nickerson. So we got about 12 people working with us here at Story Studio Network. And on Saturday, I had the chance to kind of look back over the last few weeks to see what kind of shows, what have we been doing? Because I was just, run ragged last week. It was the craziest week. So thought it was time to pour the second cup and put an ear on some of the stuff that we're doing. So what I want to do this week, we've got 3 opportunities between now and Thursday to highlight some of the conversations that we've been having. And we're going to introduce you to a brand new show. One of them is a show that Erin is producing solo, which is fun. So buckle up for that one. We're also going to actually deal with a story that is kind of a breaking news story. And I don't say that in a CNN kind of way. It's one of these stories that is hiding in the background. And the work our team did was able to kind of take a good look at, is there a worry about the cyber security of our banks? And on the surface, people say nothing to worry about here. But we talk about the language that's used in managing and maintaining the foundations of our financial institutions around the world. So Kim Geddes and Jeff mustn't get into that. And we'll do that tomorrow because it's an important one for Cybersecurity Month, which is October. So we're just wrapping that thing up. But this week we're wrapping up our third series with Daily Bread Food Bank. And if you've been listening closely, the series has been called the 2030 Project. And the 2030 Project comes from the federal initiative back in 2015 to eliminate or reduce poverty in this country by 50%. That was a lofty, ambitious, but it seemed doable, achievable goal in 2015, considering the economic conditions that we were in. Needless to say, COVID came along and poked a stick in the spokes, and there we go. It doesn't mean it's not achievable. It just means how are we going to do this and what kind of priorities do we need to set? Who's going to do that and how do we manage it? And in the first two series of the 2030 Project, we spelled out how the system is set up almost in spite of itself to fail. And that's not a criticism of the people in the system. It's just the way it's been put together. Piecemeal, region by region, so on. In this series, we've got 6 or 7 episodes. The final episode is going to drop this week. And it's going to feature a conversation, wrapping up a conversation on the Canada Disability Benefit Act. And Minister Cara is the new minister in the role that now handles that portfolio. Her ministry deals specifically with disabilities and inclusivity. And she's the one now who's going to have to take the ball and run it across the line. Because back in June, the federal government passed the Canada Disability Benefit Act. It's a framework piece of legislation, which means they need to hang meat on the bone, if you will. Decide what this thing is going to look like region from region. If you want an example of a parallel, it's kind of like the daycare, childcare program that the feds rolled out. They had to strike a deal, come to terms with each province, not in terms of dollars and cents, but based on their regional needs and requirements. The same can be said here for the Canada Disability Benefit Act. And the whole objective here is to raise those who live with disabilities out of poverty. And if you've listened to the previous episodes in the 2030 Project, you will know that none of the disability programs is equipped or actually adequate enough to support people who have disability, who can't work. I had Kathleen Wynne on the program last week, former Premier of Ontario. And I said point blank, okay, that's great. You admit that the benefits for disabled are entirely inadequate. Don't you think you should have spent more money at the time rather than nibbled around the edges? Wouldn't we have been in a better place if you had put the right amount of money in those pockets 10 years ago when you were Premier? And she admits, yeah, should have done more. Should have done more. Didn't. Here's where we are. And it's not just on her. That happened right across the country. So here's a new opportunity. A new window is opening here to step forward and do the right thing. We cannot afford poverty in this country. Yet we pay it out. $30-odd billion a year here in Ontario alone. If you look at the national number, it's up over $80 billion a year. That's the cost of poverty. So before you tell me we can't afford any of this stuff, I want you to explain to me how we can afford poverty at those rates. So, going to feature here the first episode of the third series for the 2030 Project, and it sort of sets the stage. And you'll listen to the call to action at the end of it. And it it just demands that if you disagree with what's being said, fine. But I can't imagine that you want to see people living in poverty. I can't imagine that anybody listening would want to legislate poverty. You want to do something about it? Pick up the phone, fire off an email, whatever it might be, text message to all of your elected members of government, all levels, and tell them that this is important. Make them aware that you are aware that you don't want to be paying for poverty anymore. All right. Enjoy. This is the 2030 Project for the Daily Bread Food Bank. I'm Dave Trafford, and this is the 2030 Project. The 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. After 3 years of consultations, legislative crafting, committee reviews, and political pushing and pulling in the House of Commons and in the Senate in Ottawa, the Canada Disability Benefit Act finally received royal assent on June the 21st, 2023. It's intended to raise those living with disabilities in Canada out of poverty. Can it? Will it? Two simple questions, but they're big ones right now. And when, as we said, we spent 3 years in consultation and trying to craft the legislation, it got interrupted by an election call. It finally gets royal assent, as we said. There's a soon come, hurry up, what's your worry kind of feel to this. There's a lot of anxiety and anxiousness around getting this thing done right. And of course, it's all against the backdrop of what we've been doing here at the 2030 Project over the last couple of years now, and that is kicking around this possibility, the idea of reducing poverty by 50% by the year 2030. That's kind of flown by. I'm not even sure whether or not that's a relevant metric anymore, given what we've gone through with the pandemic. But this does take a step in the right direction, and that's what we're hearing from those who are advocates, those who are sort of with lived experience. And so I thought let's start this off just to kind of set the tone with our friends at Daily Bread Food Bank. Talia Bronstein takes care of advocacy and research for the food bank. Neil Hetherington is the CEO. And, I know, Talia, you and I have been kind of back and forth on this over the last probably 3 or 4 months. There was even some anxiety as to whether or not that legislation was going to get passed before a summer break. And there was real relief when it got royal assent. But it's only one small step. Is that fair to say?
It's definitely fair to say. We're recording this at the moment in August, and the act still hasn't actually come into force yet. And so, we're waiting for the regulation process to truly kick off, and we're really hopeful that we're going to see movement quickly on this. I think there's a real urgency to the situation we're seeing right now, where food bank visits continue to rise at an enormous rate, and close to half of the clients we're serving have a disability. So this is really an urgent issue that requires an important investment in income support for this population. So we're hopeful that we will move quickly on this and we will see some results soon.
And I think the key to this, though, Neil, is that we're talking about a process that is going to, or purports to, promises to, include those with lived experience, those who are from the disabled communities in this country. And I'm learning that you can be disabled in Ontario and not necessarily disabled in another part of the country, depending on how we define it and what the eligibility and the criteria is. But I guess the positive part of it is that we've kind of landed on the need to get this accomplished.
Yeah, I think there is a universal feeling that this is absolutely needed. It's needed because it would align with the values that we espouse as a country. It's needed because it has the potential to lift millions of people out of extreme or deep poverty. And, we here at the Daily Bread Food Bank need it because it has the promise and the hope of decreasing the lineups outside of food banks. And you touched on, the disability communities being included in the process. The thing that I've liked about the creation of the law is that they go beyond that. They talk about co-creation of these regulations with those communities. And I think that that is important. I had a sense of maybe a sense of guilt associated with advocating at the House of Commons in committee about this, and at the Senate, where I'm not a member of that community, but I just know and want to be an ally to them as we try to make things better. Talia already mentioned some north of 40% of individuals who are accessing food banks have a disability. And it's so far off where I think things need to be, where somebody on disability in Ontario is getting some $1,200 a month when the poverty line is some $2,300. So I'm anxious. I'm hopeful. We've put a lot of our eggs in this basket in terms of a policy change that will result in something fundamentally good happening to a community where not a lot of good has happened from government policy over the last number of decades.
Yeah, and it's easy to throw around phrases, Talia, like equity and accessibility. And we here in Toronto, as we record this, we easily focus on what Neil referred to in terms of the Ontario programming. But, what I'm learning as I'm talking to more people about this is that the accessibility to benefit programs like this at a provincial level are not equal necessarily. We don't have the same definition of who is disabled in this country. So there's a lot of granular work to be done here to get it right. Do we have to get it right the first time?
It's a funny question because I don't think there's ever been, a benefit that has been designed perfectly from the get-go. But I don't think that should cause us to throw our hands up and say, well, we're not going to get it right anyway, so why bother? I think in design there is a degree of iteration that needs to happen, and learnings that happen once you apply it in the field, and you do learn as you go. But I do think there's an immense amount of expertise about the lived experience of people with disabilities, about the shortfalls of current programs, about design considerations. So I think the government will be well prepared to design a strong benefit as long as they do go down that road of co-creation. And that's why I'm so excited for this podcast, because we've assembled those voices. Mm-hmm. We are about to hear from leading experts, people who have lived experience with disability, who are at the forefront of organizations who have been advocating for the Canada Disability Benefit. And they're going to tell us exactly how this benefit should be designed. And so I think, we're doing some of the government's homework for them. And hopefully that will be helpful, and that'll hopefully get us to a better place.
Well, I don't want to spill the beans, but I got to tell you that there's a lot of strong points of view in those voices that you presented. We've been talking to them over the last couple of weeks, and we'll roll through this as we go. But a couple of the things that just sort of popped to mind first. I don't think a lot of people think of the First Nations communities as something specific within the disability community in terms of what their particular needs are. And, we're going to get into that, but it was one of these things. I think it might be a blind spot for us, Talia.
Yeah, I mean, the disability community is not a monolithic community. It's intersectional. There's people with intersecting identities that need to be taken into consideration. The experience of, a person living with a disability in an urban center versus a rural, someone who is racialized versus not, someone who is Indigenous versus not. These are all individuals who are going to have a very different experience of disability, depending on the type of disability, how we define disability, as you mentioned, whether we're talking about physical disabilities, episodic disabilities, invisible disabilities. There is so much diversity within the disability community, and that really needs to be both reflected in terms of the design of the benefit, but also in terms of the voices that are being heard when we're talking about and we're consulting and we're engaging on what this should look like. We need to make sure that those voices are at the table.
If we go back to that stat that you guys talked about off the top, that 4 in 10 food bank users, clients are from a disabled community of some sort. Neil, I can't get over the fact that maybe we're also missing the point that poverty in and of itself is a disability. I mean, we are disabled if we have to live in poverty.
It's just another hurdle that is put in front of a community that does not need that. And often we hear the language of nobody should be legislated to be in poverty, but yet that is what we do with our current social assistance programs, in particular disability. And we legislate that for as long as they are making use of that plan, that they are always going to have to live within deep poverty. And that is fundamentally wrong. They have to rely on charity. They have to rely on friends and family in order to make ends meet. And so again, I go back to that hopeful moment. We haven't had a lot of systemic change in the advocacy work that we have been calling government on. And this is that ray of light that I am anxious between now and when the regulations are formulated at the end of January in 2025 or 4, that we will see something hopeful.
Yeah, and again, pointing back, and you've talked about this before, there are other federal programs that have been put in place that have actually served kids in our country, seniors in our country. So while this is a new path, there is a precedent for this actually having, dare I say, an ROI that makes sense in terms of lifting people out of poverty.
Yeah, we saw it with the child tax benefit and the positive aspects that it had on lifting many out of poverty. We saw the positive economic benefits associated with $10 a day daycare. That advocates worked hard to be able to make that happen, and our economy ended up doing well because of that, and the people did well because of that. And we've had this thing where, okay, you're between sort of 18 and 65, and the disability plans across the country are only going to provide so much income, and that income is just dismal. And so here is an opportunity for us to be able to lift again millions of people out of legislative poverty, and I hope we seize this.
Well, and it'll be some heavy lifting to do, Talia. And I think that when we get down to it, as granular as it is, what do you see as, say, the top 3 things that we're going to have to tackle to make this conversation, make this discussion worthwhile, and have something that we're able to at least have a good start with? Because I get the sense this is more. It'll be more of a process. It won't be a final product that we get from the government. It should be a living, breathing, organic almost set of regulations that deal with the ongoing and the developing needs of the disabled in this country.
Well, the benefit of regulations is that they are meant to be living, breathing kind of instruments. So there is the opportunity to tailor and edit as real life information kind of becomes available. But I think the biggest considerations at this point in time are, who's going to be eligible for the benefit, how are they going to access it, and how much is it going to be? And all of those considerations, there's trade-offs, right? You can have a benefit that reaches a lot of people that maybe isn't as deep of a benefit as if you targeted a small population and had a deeper benefit. our hope is that that will cast a wide net and it will bring people above the poverty line. But there's going to be a lot of considerations to weigh in terms of how do you structure the benefit? How does it end up in someone's bank account, right? How do they apply for it? Or is there automatic eligibility based on certain criteria and other programs access? It's not an easy thing to design a benefit, but it's an important one. And so we are optimistic that, through the process of the design, that there will be that engagement, and hopefully the government will be able to listen to the voices of those who are going to benefit from this new income support.
Yeah, and I guess, Neil, the other side of this is, you talk about what's the benefit and how much is, and is that going to be what it takes to raise somebody out of poverty? The experience in Toronto is going to be different than for someone living in Saskatoon, say, in terms of just the cost of living, whether it's their housing, all of those sorts of things. So at what point do we have to kind of put water in the wine, if you want, and say, this is what it's going to look like in Saskatoon, regionally in Toronto, it's this, the rest of Ontario, something else? Does it get that complicated?
Well, I think that while it might be complicated, that might also be an equitable opportunity, where using the market basket for the region that people live in has some benefit. There's drawbacks with it as well, but it has some benefit to be able to ensure that people get to that standard of living that we would want everybody to live in, and so that you do take into consideration cost of living right across the country.
So for you, Neil, and I know you've spent time in Ottawa, trying to convince the legislators to put some heft behind this effort. I know the Senate came back with some interesting amendments. They didn't all manage, but they raised some really important questions around the possibility of how we're going to integrate these programs across the country with the federal program. How does the private sector get involved? These are big issues. Did you get a sense when you were talking, or the questions that you got from the folks in Ottawa, where they see where the priorities are?
One of the things that gave me hope was that it was really right across the board on the political spectrum that people thought that this is a good thing to have happen. And so it was unifying, and I really deeply appreciated that. Yeah, there were some technical issues with the legislation. There was some nervousness. There was at the time that I was at the Senate, the question was, do we send it back for amendment and risk it getting prorogued or not not meeting the Commons agenda and then just getting left at committee? That was a real concern. But they sent it back with some amendments, and the House took those amendments and they passed it, as you mentioned in the introduction. So those were all good news items. I think there is a uniform desire to make it accessible. I look towards partnerships where the federal government has dipped its toes into areas where constitutionally they're not necessarily the lead. Things like $10 a day daycare, where they've entered into federal provincial agreements, and to be able to make those happen. So all of these things are hurdles that can be overcome, and that gives me hope. The fact that they all have the desire to see something happen. To me, the real concern is around how will they put the money behind this that it needs? You start adding it up. What's the difference between the $2,300 and the $1,200 that the province is putting in now in Ontario? Will they pony up that difference? And will it let provinces off the hook for something that they are responsible for? And how can they work together not only in 2024 but beyond? And if you add all of these things up, it can be a very expensive program. And so will the government have the leadership and the fortitude and desire to challenge the status quo and do what is fundamentally right?
Well, we've just as we record this come off a cabinet retreat in Prince Edward Island, Talia. So I want you to put your advocacy cap on here squarely. And you know, where is the worry, or is there a worry? Because they came out of that meeting and housing. Oh, and then there's housing have become the priorities. And I'm not suggesting for a second it's not a priority, but it would be easy for this particular issue to get swamped by things like housing, because that's more of a conversation around the kitchen table. This is not, and it is really a story for many people about others. So it would be easy for it to be pushed aside at some point. Where does the advocacy have to happen to make sure this stays on top of the list?
I think it's really critical that we continue to keep the heat on government to make sure that this is at the top of the priority list. I mean, I can't say that housing is not a priority, because that is, for food bank clients especially, you know, one of the biggest issues affecting food insecurity in Canada and poverty in Canada. So it's not an either or, but an and situation where they do need to be working on multiple fronts. But thankfully, government is set up to do just that. We have, you know, ministers for every portfolio. So we have a new minister. We're waiting for mandate letters at the moment to find out exactly where this benefit is going to fall. But, you know, I think the disability community has been advocating hard for this benefit and will continue to do so. And we will be there to support and bolster and amplify. And I hope other people listening to this podcast will do their part to make sure that this message that the Canada Disability Benefit is needed, it's needed now, and it needs to be adequate and accessible. That needs to be our collective message, because elected representatives are accountable to us, the public, and it's incumbent upon us to make sure that our elected representatives know what's important to us as voters and as constituents. And so I hope that anyone who's listening to this podcast will be inspired to contact their member of parliament, let them know that this is a priority issue for them, and make sure that the member of parliament knows that we need action and we need it quickly.
Yeah, I can just hear it. I'm from the government. I'm here to help. I'm just, there's going to be a lot of eyebrow raising, but I'll tell you what, let's leave it there, and we will start to, you know, peel back some of the layers here that we've uncovered as we dive into this series specifically on the Canada Disability Benefit. And what you need to understand is that our target here, as Talia has said, is your heart, your mind. We don't just want awareness. We need you to be an advocate here. So listen to it and share. Talia, Neil, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Dave.
The 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast that we are proud to produce. It is sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank. If you'd like to help eliminate poverty, start by sharing this podcast with your federal MP, your member of provincial parliament, your local municipal representatives, anyone you think needs to hear this message about the Canada Disability Benefit. And to learn more, visit dailybread.ca. Mike Trutler is our technical producer and audio editor here at Story Studio Network, and the 2030 Project is produced by the team at Daily Bread Food Bank. I'm Dave Trafford. Thanks for listening.
This
is SSN.